Good morning, y'all. It's good to see everyone this morning. It's good to be back here in our auditorium for recording today. And I was on location last week, and then actually the week before that I had recorded a week early. So it's now been several weeks since I've been here in person to record on our normal day, and it's good to be back today. Hope all of you are having a great week so far. I've enjoyed what should have been for most of you a long weekend. I hope everybody was safe and careful over the weekend, but that you still enjoyed the holiday. You've enjoyed your extra day of the long holiday weekend. Well, this morning as we continue our study of Genesis, we find ourselves in Genesis chapters 32 and 33. And really, as we think about chapters 32 and 33, the main idea I want us to look at and reflect upon this morning and think about is the idea of reconciliation. As we've been following the story of Jacob over the last few weeks, it doesn't take us looking very hard to realize that Jacob was not exactly like his father and grandfather. To this point, we haven't really seen a Jacob who would warrant inclusion with Abraham and Isaac as men and heroes of faith. To this point, we haven't even been introduced to a God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because to this point, he is not yet Jacob's God even. This coming Wednesday night, Jeff is going to be looking at Jacob as we continue our Heroes of Faith summer series. So Jeff, sorry if I happen to steal any of your thunder this week. That's just, the timing just happened to correspond to that. But as we think this morning about Jacob, we're finally going to see that transformation. As we're going to see reconciliation. Reconciliation both between Jacob and God, but also between Jacob and Esau. Healing those broken relationships that have characterized Jacob's entire life. And so with that, we begin here in chapter 32. Now, as Genesis 32 opens, it says Jacob went on his way. When we ended our study last week, at the end of chapter 31, you'll remember, it was that encounter with Laban where Jacob and his family had finally left Laban's house. But now, here they are. They're on their way, and Laban catches up to them. But they sign the peace treaty, and they go about their business. And so chapter 32 picks up. Jacob went on his way, heading back to his home. The promised land that God has promised to Jacob, that he promised to Isaac and to Abraham before him. Jacob says it's time to go home. And so it says Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's camp." These angels are important for us to understand, because the presence of the angels here serve as a reminder that God had been watching and directing the events of Jacob's life. Jacob had not been calling his own shots, as much as it may have seemed like it sometimes. As much as Jacob may have wanted to be calling his own shots, that encounter with God at Bethel, in that encounter with God at Bethel, God had told Jacob, "I will be with you and I will get you back home." He had made a promise to him. And so the angels here are a reminder of that promise of God. They are a reminder of what God has been doing and who has really been calling the shots. But Jacob is heading home, and he knows what's in store at home. You have to imagine the dread that was hanging over Jacob. As he's thinking, as he's wondering, as he's trying to figure out and worrying about what he may find. Is Esau still mad? Does he still want to kill him? Has 20 years finally allowed things to calm down? Or after 20 years, has the anger only grown even more intense? Jacob is not sure what he's heading into, but the last time he saw his brother, he fled for his life because he had stolen Esau's blessing out from under him. through an act of deception, and Esau wanted to kill him. So Jacob sends messengers to Esau. And he tells them, you shall say to my lord Esau, thus your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban and said until now, I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, male servants and female servants. I have sent to tell my lord in order that I may find favor in your sight. Jacob and Esau were twin brothers. But notice the language Jacob uses here. He refers to Esau as his lord, and he refers to himself as Esau's servant. This would have been very unusual language in the context of the ancient Near Eastern world. But nevertheless, this is the language that was used. Because what we need to understand is this was not a normal circumstance. Normally, one twin brother would not have said this to his other twin brother. But we just talked about all the reasons why this situation is not normal. But it's also interesting that what we see here. The messengers do eventually return, but Jacob sent out messengers. There's an interesting word play here in the Hebrew that we don't see in the English. But in the Hebrew language, the word for angels and messengers are the same word. This tells us something. It points us to a reminder about reconciliation. It shows us that reconciliation with God is necessary for reconciliation with man. That God's angels are there, God's messengers are there with Jacob. Jacob is going to reconcile with God in this process. And until he does that, until he is right with God, there cannot truly be peace in his relationships with his family, with his brother. That we have to be in a right relationship with God before we can truly bring about a godly and biblical reconciliation with others. Well, Jacob's messengers come back and they tell him that Esau is there and that he is coming to meet Jacob, and he is coming with 400 men. And it says in verse 7 that Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. Well, that's no surprise. In the ancient Near Eastern world and in the biblical context, we see this term 400 men used several times. And what it seems to indicate is that this was the average size of a militia. So Jacob hears this and he says, my brother Esau has an army and he's marching toward me. Dude's probably feeling a little bit like it's all over. It's no wonder that he's greatly afraid and distressed. To further make matters worse, if you remember back to Abraham's encounters to save his nephew Lot, once the city of Sodom fell under control of the foreign kings, Abraham defeated 4 different kings in that battle with only 318 men. If Abraham defeated 4 kings with just 318 men, imagine what Esau might do to Jacob with 400, because Jacob wasn't even armed. Well, it finally seems that Jacob is beginning to get it. That he's finally beginning to understand something. And here in chapter 32 and verse 9, Jacob does the one thing he should have been doing all along. He turns to God. And he appeals to the mercy and the protection and the grace of God. Here in verse 9, Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred that I may do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have before 2 camps. Now I have become 2 camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you said, I will surely do you good, and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. Jacob prays to God here. And in doing so, he does a couple of things, 3 things that are really worth us noting. The first thing is he reminds God of his promise. Now, God didn't need to be reminded of his promise. God knew what he had promised Jacob at Bethel. But sometimes this is an important thing for us to do. Reminding God of the promises He has made to us is a way of comforting ourselves and reassuring ourselves of the faithfulness of God. Then Jacob acknowledges God's provision. This was an important thing for Jacob. For a man who had made his life and always lived with his confidence in his own ability to provide and sustain for himself. Here he acknowledges that it was God who had blessed him, that he wasn't deserving of those blessings in any way, but God had given them anyway. And then he makes his request. He states to God that for which he is asking, to be protected from his brother Esau. And he closes by again reassuring himself and taking his confidence in the promise of God. But it is worth noting that even at this point, he is still the God of his fathers. He addresses him there as God, the God of Abraham and the God of my father Isaac. Jacob doesn't say he's my God yet. He's getting there. He's beginning to learn to trust. He's beginning to lean a little bit more on God. But he's still got some ways to go in this relationship. Well, following this prayer, Jacob concocts a plan. And he took 550 of his animals, divided among female and male goats and male and female sheep, and 30 camels and their calves, and 40 cows and 10 bulls and 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. He takes these 550 animals, divided by the types of animal they are, and he begins to send them to Esau as a gift, seemingly as showing that he is willing to pay whatever the price. He is trying to show his brother the generosity that he's capable of after years of deception. This was an absurdly large tribute. In fact, in the ancient Near Eastern world, we know from historical sources that this was an even greater tribute than some cities paid to foreign kings who were coming to conquer them. To put it in context, one commentator has estimated that this would be somewhere around $100,000 in a gift in today's society. Can you imagine having wronged someone so badly that you send them $100,000, trying to do anything to hopefully allow them to spare your life because you were so afraid for the way you treated them? This is a substantial thing. But as we move through to the latter part of chapter 32, Jacob and his family cross the ford of the Jabbok River. And when they do, once again they stop for the night. We've seen this happen before, right? Jacob stops for the night, and in those nighttime stops, he encounters God. Well, this time he again is going to encounter God, but in a different way. Verse 24 says that a man wrestled with him until the break of day. And when the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask me your name?" And there he blessed him again. Jacob tries to find out who this mysterious visitor is, and he doesn't tell him his name. Jacob asks, but the man won't tell him. Eventually, though, Jacob does realize that this man, whom he had wrestled with, was God. Now, who was the mysterious wrestler? We honestly don't know. Some have suggested that it was God himself. Others have suggested it was the angel of God. Some have suggested that it was a pre-incarnate Christ, meaning that Jesus had come and wrestled with him before he came in the form of flesh and was born of Mary. Ultimately, we don't know, but regardless, we do know is that it was clearly God whom Jacob wrestled with. And so in this match, Jacob is asked his name. This seems like a strange thing. The man wouldn't tell him his name, but he wants to know Jacob's name. And Jacob says it is Jacob. But we know what Jacob's name meant. It meant the deceiver. It seems that perhaps here this was to make a point, to force Jacob to come to terms with his entire life having been characterized by the accuracy of his name. That the child Jacob, whose name could mean liar or deceiver, had indeed lived every single day and gotten farther in life by lying and deceiving. But in this moment, his name is changed. He is no longer going to be one whose life is characterized by deception. We've talked about the name change, about the significance of names in our study of Genesis. And this is one of those moments. This is one of those opportunities where God does something significant in changing someone's name. And He changes his name to Israel, which means you have wrestled with God and man. Now, Jacob's name is not one of deception, but one of prevailing, one of overcoming, one that is characterized by his connection to God. Israel, God. Well, Jacob finally realizes that it was God whom he had wrestled with, and he renames the place Peniel, meaning I have seen the Lord face to face and lived. Jacob realizes the graciousness and the mercy of God in this moment, and he acknowledges the God that he had encountered. And verse 31 says that the sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. From that day, Jacob would move along with a limp. Every step he took would have been a little bit slower and a little bit more painful than it had been before. And in every one of those painful steps, Jacob would have been physically reminded that it was God who all along had been the sovereign authority directing his path in his life. Every step Jacob took would be a reminder of the God who ordered his steps. Well, from there we come to chapter 33. And the text of chapter 33 opens with Esau and his 400 men still coming. He saw them off in the distance. But it seems that this time Jacob was a little less worried and a little less concerned than he had been before. He had a little more confidence and a little more peace from the God whose peace surpasses all understanding. And so Jacob himself goes on before them. Jacob leaves his family behind. He goes out in front to meet his brother. And you have to imagine that there is a volleyball-sized knot in his stomach. Even though he's maybe a little less worried than he was before, he knows that this could go all kinds of haywire. And so Jacob goes and in humility and perhaps fear, bows himself 7 times to the ground. And in doing so, he gets to his brother. But instead of being angry, verse 4 says, Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. There were no more hard feelings. It had been 20 years since Jacob and Esau had seen each other. And time had healed these wounds. It had brought reconciliation. God had helped bring about that reconciliation. And in doing so, we see this beautiful moment between two brothers who were at odds, but who are now again reconciled to one another. And Esau looks up and he says, "Who are all these people with you?" And Jacob introduces him to his family, to his wives and his sons. In seeing his brother Esau, though, and in having this gracious welcome, Jacob compares it to the mercy that God had shown him the previous night. Jacob says, verse 10, "For I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me." The same thing he had said in renaming the place of Peniel. In this moment, Jacob understood even more. He says, "In the same way that I wrestled with God, and He spared me, you have spared me. You have shown me the same grace." Reconciliation had first come with God through that wrestling match, and now it has come with his brother Esau. And in both cases, reconciliation has been characterized by gracious mercy and forgiveness. Well, Esau tries to give the gifts back to Jacob. He says, "Why have you sent me all these things? I don't need them." And Jacob says, No, I want you to have them." And he finally insists and prevails upon his brother. Perhaps Jacob feels that this is the least he could do for all that he stole from his brother, from all that he took by his deception as a child. He could use the things that God had blessed him with to bless his brother Esau, since the blessings of God had been stolen from him. From there, Esau attempts to get Jacob to come with him to Edom. But Jacob says, No, you go along. It'll be really slow traveling with me. I've got women and kids and all these herds, and it'll be a slow journey. You just go on. And Esau says, "Well, let me leave some of my men to protect you." And Jacob says, No, that's not necessary either. We'll come along. We'll get there. Now, Jacob wasn't really interested ever in going to live with his brother. It doesn't seem. Because pretty soon he's going to settle in the fertile land near the river. But it does show us the extent of mercy and grace and healing in this process. Well, as chapter 33 moves to its close, we see that Jacob journeyed on to the city of Succoth and built himself a house and made booths for his livestock. And then after living there, he came safely to the city of Shechem. This was land along the river that would have been fertile. Perhaps Jacob's plan for sojourning for a little while at the city of Succoth was to recoup some of that which he had lost through his gifts to Esau. Perhaps it was never to be his permanent destination. But when he got to Shechem, he bought land. He bought for 100 pieces of money the piece of land on which he had pitched his tent. That's the same piece of land that that Joseph is one day going to be buried on. It is the land in the same way that Abraham bought land in the promised land that was not yet his. Jacob is going to do it too. And as we saw with Abraham buying this land, even though it's not going to be theirs for hundreds of years, indicates great faith. And so, in verse 20, chapter 33 comes to a close with these words. There he erected an altar, and he called it El Elohe Israel. God, God of Israel. This is the final piece of the puzzle we've been waiting for in Jacob's journey of faith. Finally, here as chapter 33 comes to a close, the God of Abraham and Isaac becomes the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He is the God of Israel. And that is a beautiful story of reconciliation and faithfulness, and a long time coming in the interaction between Jacob and God. But as we close this morning, I think these stories of Jacob's reconciliation here remind us of one major idea. One that is found in the characterization between fear and faith. Jacob in many ways had lived a life of fear rather than faithfulness. Because in this regard, Jacob had lived a life of self-sufficiency. And self-sufficiency is a manifestation of fear. It is a lack of faith. Because when we truly have faith, we don't try to do it on our own. We rest in the power of God. But at every step of the way, Jacob had tried to go about it his own way. Not living in faith, but living in fear that God would not do it. And so instead, he puts his confidence in himself and his own power. But self-sufficiency is never going to get us there. As much as we try to go about it on our own and do things ourselves, we in and of ourselves cannot do it. And y'all, this is hard. I will be the first to tell you, this is something I struggle with a lot. I have plans. I know it's going to come as a surprise to all of you, but I really like to be in charge of what I'm doing. I like to know what's going to happen. I like to be the one directing and ordering paths. But y'all, we've got to learn. I've got to learn to be better about being less self-sufficient and relying more on God. Because you see, until we truly break the power of self-sufficiency in our lives, we cannot experience the fullness of God's grace. It was not until Jacob had wrestled with God and his hip had been popped out of socket in that process that Jacob finally realized the fullness of God's grace. It wasn't until he put his trust in God to handle the reconciliation with Esau that he fully understood what grace looks like. Until we learn to yield the power of me, we can never experience the power of God. The Apostle Paul put it this way. When I am weak, then I am strong. It is only when we are too weak ourselves that we can truly become strong in the might of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. As we think about Genesis 32 and 33, may we be people who seek reconciliation. May we reconcile our relationships with God if they need to be repaired. And may we reconcile broken relationships with others. Learning that in everything we do, it is God who is in charge, and it is God who is showing us grace. May we be people who rely on that grace.